What's up, model makers? It's time for episode 2 of the great miniart D7 Caterpillar bulldozer adventure. And this one ended up being a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, about 45 minutes. So I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Let's just get right into it. This time we're going to talk about a little bit about the frame and engine subassembly, but mostly this is going to be all about the tracks. Let's go. Okay, first things first. Before I move on to talking about the tracks, let me just show you where I'm at with the main part of the chassis and the engine. As you can see, pretty much all of the assembly is done on the left-hand side, and most of the thing is got at least some form of paint on it. As I think I mentioned in the first segment, I've got some yellow paint just to make sure that I've got some color in areas that I won't be able to get to with my airbrush. It's probably not even the exact correct yellow, but not a big deal because those aren't going to show much, especially after all the weathering. What I did want to do was make sure that I was ready to put some of the actual yellow color that should be arriving pretty soon on areas that I'm going to have to spray first, like the front of the engine. And I've also done that on the back sides of all the parts that made up against this, like the fan belts, the pulleys, the fan blade, radiator, etc., because I'm going to have to take this in stages to get it all done effectively. So I've done that. I've also added a little bit of wiring. It's tough to see, but if you look down in there underneath the starter, you should be able to see that I've got a couple of leads going to the starter motor. I have also added the ignition conduit. You can see for the pony motor, you can see it right there angling down in front of the pony motor cylinder. That's just a piece of lead wire that I shaped there. And then I also have a couple of spark plug wires coming out of it, but because they're routed around on the back side of the cooling pipe that goes into the top of the pony motor's cylinder head and kind of underneath the intake manifold there, you can just barely see those ignition wires. I don't even know how I'm going to get paint on them when it comes time to make them black, but yeah, whatever, it is what it is. I'm kind of disappointed at how little they show, but it's one of those things that, I had to do it, and so we'll see. I've got a little bit of rust-colored paint here on the intake manifold because that's where the exhaust from the pony motor runs into it, and I'm going to want to scrub some of the yellow paint off around that, and I thought it would be easier to go ahead and put a little bit of the rust on there since I had it out and I was doing things with it like spraying the aforementioned exhaust manifold from the pony motor. You can see what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on there before I start spraying the rest of the paint on the engine, and I'm going to just use some liquid mask to cover up that rusty part because this is kind of a weird little deal. This is one casting on the real thing. This is one casting that's got the intake and the exhaust in one chunk. And so that part that sticks straight up right there will end up being yellow, while all the rest of it down there at the bottom is the exhaust portion and it'll be rusty. So kind of a weird deal, but I think it'll turn out all right. I also have added a few more tiny little things here and there and brought my broken parts total up to 3, and you can see both of them in this shot. One of them is the linkage for this lever right here on the back side of the cylinder head. I'm not sure what that is or what it does, but you can see that linkage was broken into 3 pieces. and had to be rescued. And what I do with those is once I get them off the sprue, I just put them on the top surface of my anvil and position them as best I can, and then just run a little bit of Tamiya extra thin around it to get it glued back together. And generally, it will come off the steel surface of the anvil fairly easily, maybe a day later when it's good and cured. There's also I believe that's an oil filler spout coming up out of the top of the transmission there. And it got broken coming off the sprue and had to be repaired as well. So not too bad, so far. Those are the only fatalities on that part of the assembly, and I guess really that they're not even fatalities because I was able to rescue each one, so not too big of a deal. All right, so I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to talk about this little chunk of fun right here. And let's see, let me zoom in a little bit, get a better position. And what we have here is one of the track, I don't know exactly what you call this, the track runner assemblies. I don't know exactly what it is, but basically the track wraps all the way around this thing. And this, putting this thing together was the end of the honeymoon with this kit. Whereas everything with the engine block and the frame and all of that really impressed me with the quality of the fit and the engineering. Not so much on this thing. And I'm going to show you what I mean by looking at the instructions, where it's a lot easier to see each individual piece. So let me grab that, and I'm also going to show you some of the unassembled parts from the other side, and we'll have a look at what some of the issues were. And I'm not alone on this. I've talked with somebody else who built this kit and who also ran into the same frustrations that I did. So it is what it is, but it's definitely not your imagination if you're in the middle of this thing and you find yourself cursing the way things are going. Okay, so here we go. Here's where the trouble starts, all right? This is the first thing that you've got to do, is combine these three pieces to form one of the trusses that supports the whole assembly, and then the same thing right here. And one thing to note before you do that is you've got some holes that have to be opened up, because that's what the dozer blade assembly attaches to. Now, that little bit right there is not too bad. All those parts go together pretty well. And then the next thing you do is assemble all of these roller wheels. And those are kind of a hassle, and they don't really tell you anything other than just put them together. So you're left to assume that you should just glue it all up. That, I think, may be a bad strategy, and I'll explain why here in a second. Because when you have to combine those trusses from that step and these wheels from that step right here into one structure, that's where the problem starts. Okay, so the first thing that they want you to do is, what they want you to do is take these cross members and add them to all of these slots that are on one side of the assembly. Now, let me show you what those slots actually look like. If I can find them here on the sprue. Okay, here's a good example. Okay, hopefully I can get the camera to focus right there. Oh, wrong piece, sorry. There they are. Okay, those are the slots And you can see that they are pretty shallow. Now, if you look closely, you will see that right here, you've got to assemble 3 pieces into a kind of a 3-sided box section that mates with these 2 slots over here. These are already built for you, and you're supposed to be able to just glue them in, and they go in pretty effectively. This is bad engineering. Okay, the location features that you get here, these little slots, are really not very deep, as you'll find when you go to try and assemble this, especially when you start trying to build this little chunk right here. There's nothing there that really supports those and holds them in the correct alignment. And that becomes a problem when you try to join with the other side, because, as you've probably already surmised, there are equivalent slots over here that these are supposed to match up with. And getting everything lined up between the left and the right is dependent on how well you do that. Now, here's another thing where it gets really kind of silly. If you look at all these rollers, okay, you can see that they go into these little holes right here. And what you can't really tell from the illustration is that those holes have a flat side on them. And let me show you with the actual part. Okay, hopefully you can see that and it'll focus. Come on, camera, focus on the closest thing. There we go. So you can see that the top side of each of those carriers is flat. And what's supposed to happen is that they mate with the flats that are molded onto the ends of each one of these axles that these little wheels rotate on. And there's one on each end of those. Now, that in and of itself is not such a bad thing. I don't really understand why they have to be that way, but it's not a big deal, except that they've compounded the problem by giving you this. See right there? There's a slot in the end of that round part. Okay? And what you can't really tell from the instructions is that that slot is supposed to mate with these protrusions on either side of the hole in the carrier. And let me see again if I can show you on the actual part. This is the opposite side of it from what we were looking at a second ago. Come on, focus up there. There we go. That gets it to focus. Now you can see those slots. I'm sorry, those protrusions right there on either side of the hole for the axle. So what happens is, let me see if I can find, let's see if I've got, yeah, here we go. Let me grab some tweezers so you can see this. Okay, so take a look at that part. That is one of the shaft pieces for the roller wheels. And you can see that it's got that slot molded into the end of it. It's got that round part molded onto the end of it with that little slot. And that slot lines up with the flat that's on the opposite end of it, which you can see better in this picture. There's the flat, and the slot is over here on this piece that's molded in, and they're parallel to each other. Well, if the fit were real precise between this round part and this flat, you wouldn't have a problem, because this slot would be parallel to this slot and parallel to the flat, which would then mean that when you insert the roller wheel axle into the carrier over here on this piece, that the notch in the little round thing right here would automatically line up with the protrusions on either side of the carrier hole. Hopefully that all makes sense. The problem is that it doesn't make sense in actual practice because there is quite a bit of slop between the hole in the middle of this round part and this axle. So getting this piece and this piece to be parallel just doesn't happen, which means that when you try to get the notch on either end of the axle to be parallel with both, to fit with both of the protrusions over here and over here, it doesn't happen, which means that these two sides of the assembly don't go all the way together, which means that you get even less engagement between the notches on this truss and these little box section structures here. So I didn't find all that out until I was well into the process, and I ended up having to do some serious finagling to get it all to happen, and I did, so no harm, no foul. But what I think I'm going to do next time on the other side is, instead of putting it all together and gluing it up the way that they suggest here in the instructions, is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this shaft and I'm going to bring it over to this piece, and I'm going to glue it in to this carrier the way that it's supposed to be. Then I'm going to just lay that on the bench so that the shafts are sticking straight up, and I'm going to just add all of these wheels onto each one of the shafts with no glue, and then finish off with this piece, and again with no glue. Then, because I'll already have these box sections added to this truss, then I'll just bring the other truss over and assemble it, and all of this stuff will be basically able to wiggle around because there won't be any glue on any of it. And once I've got the two sides of this assembly glued together with these box sections, then if I feel like I need to, I can come back and add some glue to make sure that all of these halves of all of these rollers are correctly lined up, even though the truth is ain't nobody gonna see any of them, because look, this is the way that the thing sits in real life, and those rollers are clear under here under the bottom. So even if they're a little bit ugly, as long as the track fits in there correctly, you know, it's really not a huge penalty, especially if you've got a bunch of mud and stuff wadded up in there. And as far as the top goes, you definitely won't see any of that because, and this is why I've got the top part of it already primed. If you look over here in this step, you've got a cover that's going to go over all of that, so none of it's going to be visible. So, not a huge penalty if it's not perfect. So, hopefully that all makes sense. I feel like I just really kind of rambled through that, and I hope that it all was sort of coherent and you can see kind of what the issue is. This is just one of those things where somebody like Tamiya, I think, would have done a far better job on this. And I understand the challenges, but for something like this to go together the way that they want it to, it really has to be precisely engineered. I don't think that making it a sloppy fit, while that might be sort of intuitive, was necessarily the best way to go, because instead of making it easier for you to put it together correctly, it actually ends up making it harder. Now, here's another little fun thing. If you look right here, you'll notice that what they tell you to do with part C44 is cut it in two and then assemble these two pieces of photo etch to it. That, I'm sorry, is again just silly engineering. This should be, C44 should be two separate pieces, so that this one inserts into this one and you can add the photo etch, because cutting it perfectly straight is a huge hassle. It's a tiny little part. And then getting it to line up correctly here where you add it to the top part of this structure, again, is just very difficult to get it perfect. Doesn't make a huge difference in the long run because it is going to be covered up, but it's definitely something to look out for. Something else to look out for that I've been warned about is to make sure that the tracks fit properly on these top roller wheels. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to even add them until after I've got all this structure complete and I've got a complete set of tracks that I can lay on there and make sure that those are lined up correctly. Here's something that I forgot to mention, and that's to talk about this part of the assembly right here, where you're taking this roller wheel and its whatever you call that, fork, and sliding it into the end of this assembly here. And this is where not having everything perfectly aligned because of this whole issue can come back to haunt you. What happens is that this assembly, this subassembly, slides into the end of this other section and mates with a couple of protrusions on the insides of these trusses. And you can just kind of see in there where they do that. It's almost, let's see, you can't see it on the instructions, but let's see if you can see it on the actual parts. Let's see, not really. Well, you just have to take my word for it that that's what happens. Anyway, it just slides in from the end here, and you push it all the way in until the end of the fork lines up with the end of this spring tension adjuster right here. And so you've got a couple of things that have to come together there and line up properly, as you can see. And you can see why you would like to have the two pieces of that adjuster be perfectly lined up because everything, has to meet at this point right here. And how, when you have to cut it apart and then glue it back together around this little bit of photo etch, that can be a little bit sketchy. And you can see I don't have it glued back together perfectly, but I did all of this with the parts a little bit soft because that was the only way to get everything positioned correctly, and that's just how it ended up. Now, what you can't see is that because the two halves of this truss assembly were not perfectly lined up, this wheel was sitting in there cockeyed. It was angled. Come on, camera, focus up there. It was angled clockwise just a little bit, and so you can just barely see it underneath here. I had to go in there with my knife, reach in with my knife point, and slice off the protrusion that this piece rests against so that I could essentially push the top of the wheel over counterclockwise, and I put a 20,000ths shim of styrene under there. You can just barely see it, that little white piece peeking out under there. And that got the wheel where it was straight and true with the world. So, problem solved, but again, that's how bad engineering and poor fit can cascade several steps down the instruction sheet and ended up causing you a world of hurt. Okay, speaking of the tracks, let's take a look at those and talk about the process that I've come up with for assembling them. But before we do that, let's just look at the parts themselves and the instructions. Okay, as you can see, you've got a sprue. You've got 8 of these sprues, and I was curious. I did the math. You can see there's a lot of sprue clipping to do. There's 110 gates to clip on each of these 8 sprues. So you better have a good set of sharp clippers. I use my Zurons. They work really well. And I will say that how well you do at clipping these off will have an effect on your success. In particular, when you look at these 2 gates on the top of this link plate. You want to make sure that you get those very flush, and the reason for that will become clear here in a second. But before I go on to that, let me advise you of something that will definitely trip you up and is much easier to fix while these link plates are on the sprues. Okay, take a look at that one right there. That's a good example. Look at the hole on the right-hand side there. You should be able to see that there's a little bit of micro flash on the inside diameter of that hole. This one is the same, but maybe not quite as bad. Now look at the same part over here. See how much larger the ID of that right-hand side hole is? That's what it's supposed to look like. And this is what it looks like on about half of the parts. What I strongly recommend is, if you don't have one, don't even start this project without one of these, a round diamond file, because you can use this to go in there and clean out, very carefully, clean out any of the any of these little holes that are undersized, and do it before you take the part off the sprue. I think the reasons why should be obvious, because messing with these little tiny things once they're cut loose is a bad plan, and you don't get any extra ones. So just keep that in mind. Okay, once you get to the part about assembling the link plates to the track pads, you're going to see something else that's a lot of fun here. Take a look at this inside surface of the trackpad, and you can see you've got a series of holes there. The 4 holes in the middle are the ones that are supposed to mate with the tiny, tiny little pins on the edge of that trackpad. Yeah, it's really kind of a joke. This would be maybe a good system if, in fact, the pins and the holes were all perfectly molded, but they're not. And you're going to see that once you get into this. That, like, here's a good example right here. If you look at that trackpad right there, if the camera will focus, you can see that the holes are not uniform in size and not perfect. So that's a bad problem. What ends up happening is that your Tamiya Extra Thin will soften the pins, and the fact that you've got those mating holes there ends up not really mattering much anyway, because the little pins just get smeared right off. So that is not such a great thing. Now here's another thing that's going to trip you up, and that's these link pins. First of all is the fact that they are shouldered, which means that you've got to put the link plates on from each end, which I personally don't think is the greatest. I've never built any tracks before, but just my engineering brain tells me that things would be a lot easier if this pin were a single diameter and you could slide it all the way through from one side to the other. But as you can see, the outside of the hole on the outside link plate is smaller than the hole on the inside link plate, and so you don't have a choice about that. And part of the reason why I believe that this would be better if these pins were a single diameter is because I saw a guy on the web who was putting this together, and he gave up on doing it with these pins and actually just got himself some styrene rod that, of course, was uniform diameter, and used it for pins and just blew these off. And another reason for doing that is that you'll find when you cut these loose from the sprue, it's pretty much impossible to get that gate remnant completely gone, even with really sharp clippers. And you'll find that with even a little bit of the remnant on the pin, it will not slide through the large hole on the link plate. So that can cause you some problems. So just be really careful in how you clip these off, and do your best not to leave any remnants, because even though it's possible to clean those pins up once they're loose, it is very difficult. you basically have to glue them down to something with some blue tack and then use a magnifier and a knife point, and it's no fun. I've only had to do it to a few of them, but that was enough. Now that you've seen the parts up close, let's talk about their assembly method. They sort of they sort of act like this is magic, and this instruction section here is pretty frustrating because basically they just show you how these are all sort of supposed to magically combine themselves, and they suggest even doing it without any glue. Now what they're really saying specifically is don't get any glue in the larger of the two holes in the link plates. And they're right, you definitely do not want to do that. But you do have to have some glue between the smaller outside link plate hole and the small end of the pin. Otherwise, everything falls apart. So that will come into play here in a few minutes when we talk about how I'm actually assembling these things. Then when you look at this step, they act sort of like you're going to take this completely magically assembled chain of link plates and pins and then just start adding these track pads that are going to drop perfectly onto the little pins that are on the link plates. Now, hopefully you can imagine along with me what a terrible plan that is, because there's slop between the pins and the plates, and the odds of you getting all four of the alignment pins on the plates in exactly the right position to mate with the four holes on the track pads are about as good as you win in the lottery. So just trust me, it ain't going to happen for you. But we will address that here in a second when I show you the method that I came up with for putting these silly things together. Okay, so here is step one of my process for building these crazy tracks. As you can see, I've made myself a small fixture. I just took a block of basswood and I've drilled a straight line of 1.6 millimeter holes in it. And the first thing I do is I fill each one of those holes with one of these track pins. Now, 1.6 millimeters is slightly too large, but by the time you account for the whatever remnants of clipping off the gate runner you've got, it works pretty good. And that little bit of slop proves to be helpful, especially as difficult as it is to get this line, the spacing on these holes exact, unless you're, using a Bridgeport mill with a digital readout. I just did it on my little drill press for my Proxon, and I set the spacing with my after measuring it with my digital calipers at exactly 6 millimeter. And my holes have proven to be close enough, if not just exactly perfect. You could do this without the benefit of a drill press, but it's nice because I know that the holes are at least in there straight. So anyhow, I've got, I put a pin in each one of the holes, and then I start on one end of it, and I just, sorry, the normal camera operator is on vacation this week, and so I'm filling in, and obviously I suck at it. Okay, so a little closer look here. As you can see, what I'm doing is I just start adding a link plate from the right-hand side here. Basically just doing it so that I can overlap each new one as I work my way along. And then what I'll do is I'll come along and I'll put a little bit of Tamiya extra thin right there where the pin sticks up above the edge of that boss right there. And it doesn't take much. And you really don't want to use much because you may need to come back and adjust the angle, the position of that pin later if it proves to be, not quite 90 degrees coming out of the link plate. This little fixture does a pretty good job of that, but I've had a few of them where they were off enough that they needed to be adjusted at a later stage. Anyhow, what I do then is once this is all complete, I come back with my X-Acto blade and I just very gently poke it under there and twist it, and that will lift that pin up a little bit, and I work my way along and just gradually lift that thing up until it's completely free of all those holes. You don't want to be too rough with it because it's fragile. But before I do that, this is also the place where I deal with any gate remnants that are pretty bad, like this one, for example, because the thing is held perfectly for me, and all I have to do is come in there with my sharp knife point and clean that up. So this little fixture has proven to be fantastic because I can do this particular step very quickly. Okay, so let's just do that. Let me see if I can release this chain of plates from the fixture right here on camera without breaking anything. Looks like I've got one that's a little sticky. There it goes. I probably should have waited a little longer for the extra thin to set up before I did that, but there's a reason that I went ahead and decided to tackle it. I just want to make sure that I did not get any glue in between any of those link plates, because obviously that's a bad thing. So again, that's another reason for making sure you only use a little bit when you secure that pin in there on the outside of each plate. Okay, the next step is going to take place on this little fixture that I've made, and what I've done here obviously is create a set of guides to make sure that all of the track pads are straight and true, at least mostly. And what I did is I just took two of them and positioned them in between these pieces of styrene cardstock to make sure that the width was correct, and then just added a little bit of extra thin to glue them in place. Then I added some small pieces of 20 thousandths styrene sheet underneath. And the reason that I did that is because, see, when you look at the outside of the trackpad, it's got that ridge on there. And in order for it to sit level in this fixture, you need that little block underneath it right there. So that takes care of getting the pads fixtured. And after I've got all of them laid in here, I come back with this length of plates and pins that I just took out of the other fixture, and I add one plate to this end of it, and I very carefully get first of all this side positioned and glued down and let that set for a few minutes, and then I come back and I very carefully position this one on the opposite side. Now, the reason that I'm emphasizing that I do it very carefully, I mean, that should go without saying, but I take a lot of care with this very first one because that sets me up for the rest of the pattern. Any errors that I introduce right here on this end are going to just get worse as I work my way down the length of that chain. So you want to be careful with all of them, but definitely be careful with the very first one. They've given you a little bit of slop with the fit of the pins. So, they don't have to be 100% perfect. I have my opinions about that as a strategy, but it is what it is. So at any rate, they don't have to be 100% perfect, but if you, obviously the better job you do positioning them, the better off you'll be. Now, once I've given those links plenty of time to set up, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along and I'm going to add link plates on each one of these pads, and I'm going to start gluing them down, working from this end and heading towards the other end, and just making sure with each one that it's lined up with these little holes that they give you in the surface of each one of these pads. And when it's all said and done, what you should end up with is something that looks like this. Okay, there you have it. You can see that things have gotten a little more serious with this thing since episode 1. Whereas, at least for me, the first part was all fun and games, and I felt like I was doing, good old-fashioned engine building work, except 35 times smaller. This foray into track building and track support infrastructure, I don't know what else you call that thing, has been a little less amusing. But it's just part of the adventure, and we got to get it done so we can get to the fun part. And hopefully in part 3 we'll be into that, and I will have all of the track assemblies done, and we'll be doing some painting. So hopefully you'll stick around for that. All right? If you're still watching, as always, I appreciate it. Take care. Much love.